Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're at and when you see this. My name is Justin. I'm the Mealworm guy. Glad to have you here. We're going to do some Mealworm Q&A. Somebody sent over some questions via email, so we're going to walk through those. There's a total of 7 this morning, so we're going to walk through those, get that posted. I wanted to do a video reply. I like doing it this way to give some more context. I'm able to say a lot more and hopefully get that across better than just manually typing that in an email. So let's get going. First question, can I use small round clear water gel for feeding the beetles and the mealworms? I'll give you a photo below. And then this person inserted a photo. My response to anybody who asks me the questions about the water gel crystals and whether or not they can be used, my response to that is check with the manufacturer. There are a broad spectrum of products that are out there. A lot of times they're used for insects or plants, and it's best to reach out to that manufacturer and say, hey, I'm going to use this for feeding to live insects. Is that okay? Is there anything detrimental that's going to happen? And see if they will respond to that. What I would also suggest is you stay away from any coloring. Anything that has added dyes or color, it's unnecessary from an insect farming perspective. So why introduce that as a variable into the mix? What I can tell you is the water gel crystals that I use, they're a polymer gel powder. And so I'm probably going to butcher this, but I'm going to try anyway. It is a cationic polyacrylamide powder. So it's non-toxic, ecologically neutral, and after it breaks down into water, carbon dioxide, and nitrogen. So those things are naturally occurring. It is a man-made polymer, so it is something that we have to physically build. It doesn't occur in nature, but then once it breaks down, it turns into some very natural elements. So that's what I'm using right now in the farm. Second question. When you start spraying, when do you start spraying the eggs or baby mealworms with water after we separate from the adult beetles? So we start spraying those approximately a week and a half to 2 weeks after we separate the beetles out. I like to give that window there because I don't want to spray those trays and get the eggs wet. I'm not sure if that causes them to not be viable, but it's not something that I'm wanting to risk right now. I think I need to do some more research on that before I change what I'm currently doing. So what I'll do is I'll wait a week and a half to 2 weeks, let those babies hatch out, and then we start the spraying regimen up until we see exoskeletons on the top. And so we'll spray the younger trays with just a real quick psh, 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 psh. And then as the trays get older, as we're spraying, we'll give them a little bit more. And then we stop. Once there's exoskeletons on the top of that tray, as they've grown over those last, usually about 4 weeks is the average for us right now, we'll switch them over to water gel crystals. What I find is if I continue spraying, then the exoskeletons on the top just kind of go everywhere because they're very light and airy. And I'm concerned about getting the sides of the trays dirty to allow the mealworms to escape out. So I'm going to test that a little bit because spraying water would actually be much more convenient from a process perspective. I wouldn't have to make water gel crystals. So over time I am going to test that out and see if it truly does cause any issues to just continue spraying them up until we're ready to harvest. All right, question number 3. How old is your mealworm that is ready to sell? So once that beetle lays the egg, how much time is there between that and a harvestable mealworm? For us here, it's about 8 to 10 weeks. And that is in optimal temperatures of roughly 78, 79 degrees Fahrenheit and 70% humidity. So we regulate that temperature and that humidity to make sure it stays in a decent range there. We don't want to go too much over 80. I like to have a little wiggle room in the event that there's a problem. Especially in the summer here in Missouri, it can get pretty hot. And so if something were to happen, like the air conditioner goes out, if I'm at 78 degrees, then I have a little bit more time before it gets into that getting, mealworms dying from too much heat. Optimal is a little bit higher than that, right? Like 80 to 85. But I like to have a couple extra degrees just to mitigate a risk and give me a bit more time to respond to something if something did happen. And then the other thing to factor in from a sellable mealworm is what does your customer want to buy? So there are customers that want to buy smaller mealworms to feed to like baby reptiles, for example, or baby mammals. And then there are folks that want really, really large mealworms that usually require some chemicals, a juvenile hormone to get them to not pupate, so they'll get bigger and bigger. So what we're doing here is we are harvesting and we are selling 3/4 inch average mealworms to our customers. So I don't currently sell smaller than that, and anything bigger than that is going to pupate and become the beetle. And so we keep those larger ones in the colony to keep the colony going. So that's the average size. About 3/4 of an inch is what we sell. Question number 4. For 1 kilogram of adult mealworms or beetles, how many kilograms of beetles does it get in average? All right, let me read that one more time. For 1 kilogram of adult mealworm, okay, the larva we're talking about. How many kilograms of beetle does it get on average? I don't have an answer to that. I haven't tracked that number because I'm not taking the pupa, or I'm sorry, I'm not taking the harvested mealworms and then keeping track of what the rate is of those harvested mealworms. We keep a percentage back to turn into beetles. I'm not checking to see what that precise exact rate is of how many of those turn into beetles. The lower death rate there, the better, right? I would say we're probably at about a 40% die-off rate. I had some issues here with moisture, the humidity level, and keeping the humidity in those bins higher. So I think I caused some die-off. That was on my end. And we've also switched to putting no bran at all in the trays for the pupa. And what I'm noticing is there's less die-off as a result of that. We're collecting more of the beetles as well. Less of them are staying in there because there's no bran to burrow down into. And so we're getting more out of it that way. But I haven't tracked that. Excuse me, I haven't tracked that down to a precise number from a 1 kilogram larva. How many do you get out of that? So I unfortunately don't have an answer for that one right now. As we move forward in time, one of the things I do want to do is start collecting different data points. So this might be a good one for us to look at in the future. Question number 5. How often do you clean the worm frass and add substrate before we ship it to a customer? That's a great question. So that's going to vary a little bit, but let's dive in. So we're specifically talking about mealworms that we're keeping to then ship to a customer. So we're not talking about the ones that we harvest or put back in order to become beetles. We're talking about the ones that have been harvested, we've taken the percentage out, and now we've got all that left over that needs to go out the door to someone. So what we will do there is I will feed them wheat bran and water gel crystals the day before they ship. So our normal customer or business to customer scenario, our website sales, eBay, Amazon, etc., all those get shipped out on Mondays. So on Sunday, I will come in and I will hydrate and put substrate into the trays of the mealworms that are going to be packaged up the next day. That way they have something to eat overnight. They're nice and full for their trip out to wherever it is they're going. And as part of the packaging process the next day, I'll sift out the frass. There'll be very little frass at that point because we've harvested them, we've collected them, we store them in cold storage to reduce pupation and keep them, kind of dormant basically. And so then when we prepare them, there's very little frass that Monday that needs to be sifted out. There's a little bit, and I'll use a custom sifter that I made that uses 1/30th mesh to go ahead and sift that out. If those mealworms don't sell, so if like right now we're getting towards the end of the summer season, we're into fall and winter in Missouri, and in general in the US it's starting to get colder going into the winter. And so the folks that use mealworms for live mealworms for feeding to birds, that is starting to slow down, right? So the birds are moving, they're not in the same places they're going to be, and so folks are needing less live mealworms right now. So in a scenario where we're cranking out all these mealworms, if those mealworms don't sell, then they'll get fed about 2 to 3 times over the course of the next week. They'll get some wheat bran, they'll get water gel crystals, and that's really just to kind of keep them satiated. We don't want to overload those trays because we want to try to control that pupation in a natural way. So we don't oversupply that tray with bran or water gel crystals because then they'll see, hey, there's a bunch of food here, let's go ahead and pupate, keep the colony going, natural response, right? So by holding that back and feeding in smaller increments, I've seen less pupation than if I just dump a bunch of bran in there and water gel crystal, and then go back a few days later, there will be just tons of pupa at that point. So it's going to vary a bit as far as how much we clean that frass out for that specific tray before it goes out the door, because it just depends on demand at the time. All right, question number 6. How often do you clean the worm skin or the exoskeletons? So as an insect grows, and this is true for all insects, as those insects grow, they shed or molt. And the exoskeleton that was there previously is kind of shed off. It's crunchy. If you grab it, it's kind of crunchy and you can squish it in your hands. It's not super dense. It's pretty easy to kind of grind up. But that's the exoskeleton. And so from a mealworm farming perspective, that exoskeleton is very light, very airy. A very small amount of wind or movement that pushes the air around can move that stuff around. And so it kind of gets everywhere, especially when we're harvesting, because it gets in the air really easily and will move around. But we don't actually clean that off in a tray ever. When we do our harvesting, if there is any buildup of the exoskeleton, then we'll go ahead and use a vacuum, and we'll hold it about 1 to 2 inches off the top of the level of the tray, or the level of the mealworms, the substrate, etc. We'll hold it about 1 to 2 inches off with the vacuum and go around and just suck that up, just to get it out of there. And what we find is that, especially during harvesting, it kind of gets in the way. It's going to slow down the sifting process if it builds up in the sifters that you're using. And then once the mealworms have been sorted, we find that as they're moving around, those exoskeletons will rise to the top. And so at that point, we'll again do that vacuum trick and suck it out. But we aren't cleaning that off of the actual trays where the mealworms are growing at all during the rearing cycle, from egg up to harvesting the mealworm. We just don't find a need for it. If there was a reason for it, or if there was an issue that caused some sort of detrimental problem with the mealworms, we would address that and change that. But for right now, we haven't seen any negative side effects outside of when we do that processing. And so at that point, we don't go through every tray. That would take quite a bit of time. What we'll do is, as we're processing those, we're putting them into the sifters, going through the sifting process. It'll start to build up in different places. And so we'll just use the vacuum again to clean that out. So, question number 7. Do you run your farm alone? How many kilograms of beetles can you handle without getting the help of a teammate or teammates? So currently I don't run the farm alone. I have 2 part-time employees, Ben and Leo. And I would say, I do a lot of ancillary stuff outside of just the farm, like these mealworm Q&As, for example. So that does take some time. I am pretty lackadaisical on the post-editing of all these videos because it's just a time constraint. So that could take additional time if you really wanted to polish these, or you had multiple social media presences outside of what I'm doing, YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, Facebook. I'm going to revamp and reignite the email newsletter, and all of that just takes time. Outside of that, though, in the current farm that we're in, I would say that one person could probably run the 1,100 trays, working 40 hours a week, which is the average, well, can't say the average U.S. Hourly worker, but 40 hours a week is a good goalpost. And so I think one person could do that right now. As we scale up, we're going to double, perhaps 2.5 times the size we're at now in the current room with more trays. That, in our current processes of how we're sifting the pupa, how we're harvesting, that's not going to be feasible for somebody to manage in a 40-hour work week on their own. We're going to need a better sifter, so I'm working on that, and we're going to need a better way to collect the pupa, which I'm working on as well. Once we tackle those two things, then I'll get a better gauge on whether or not one person can run a 1,000 square foot insect room with 2,000 or 2,200 trays, somewhere around there. I think it's feasible, but the time will tell. In our current size, we've got 1,100 trays. They're all in rotation, getting put in with different stages in the room. We also have multiple other different kinds of trays. So I've got some white dough proofing trays that are holding pupa. I've got some black cement mixing trays and some, excuse me, some restaurant bussing table totes that have superworms in them, and some mealworms as well in the black trays. So we're probably at 1,200 trays total, and we'll be up around 2,400 at a max. And I think that starts to get questionable as far as whether or not one person can handle that. We've got, in the current size of 1,100 trays, we're trying to stay at about 8 to 10% of those trays having beetles. So 80 to 100 trays of beetles. 1,500 beetles in each one of those, and then we cycle those out as they age out. Once they hit 8 weeks old, we cull them. We start a fresh beetle box whenever we've got beetles hatching. And so I'm not sure how many kilograms that equates to. It's 1,500 grams of beetles roughly. Depending on the weight of the beetle, that fluctuates a little bit. So we try to go a little bit above that, make sure we're getting enough in. So you can do the math from there from a kilogram perspective. But I think, right now with the totes we have and the trays we have, one person could do that. I've got help because I'm doing a bunch of other things. I'm working on the branding of the business, running, I do all the books. I don't have an outside accountant, so I'm doing all the books. I'm doing all of the customer service. I ship out all the orders, so I do that every Monday, and then throughout the week for any wholesale customers. I do all the engagement with those folks as well. And so that does start to add up. Depending on what your business model is going to be, if you're going to raise your mealworms and do business to customer, or do business to business, or do a mix, or do just straight wholesale to one individual, there are many different flavors that you can do here that will impact the time it takes for you to do that. If you're going to do business to customer, that's going to take more time because you're going to have issues, right? So last week I had a couple shipping issues. I've got to reship this week. I've got to address that with the customer, make sure they're okay. And so that all just takes time. But if I was rearing all of these and then selling them to one individual, then I wouldn't have that time, right? Much bigger risk there, because if that one individual says, I'm done, then I've got all these mealworms, right? So pros and cons to all that. But the amount of labor you're going to need just to strictly raise them, I think you could do a 1,000 square foot with 1,100 trays with a single individual without a problem. So hopefully this helped. If you have any additional questions on any of this, please definitely reach out to me. And if any of you out there have questions that you would like answered in a similar fashion, shoot them to me in an email, justin@midwestmealworms.com. I'll be happy to make a video response, get it posted, and hopefully help you out. So thanks for listening. Anything I can do for you, please let me know.